Imagine this. They're in your head. It sounds like science fiction, sure as simple. But what if it wasn't? Today, we're doing a deep dive into something that maybe surprisingly keeps popping up in reports, often called an open secret.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about weapons of mass control, maybe even mind control tech, or more specifically, remote neural monitoring. The idea that technology could directly influence how we think, what we perceive. And we're looking at this through the lens of work by people like Dr. John Hall, an MD from San Antonio who's spoken a lot about this. Our mission today, let's unpack what's actually been reported. What are the claims? What are the key distinctions being made?
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that gets a huge amount of play online. You see complaints, discussions everywhere, but then you look at major news outlets and, well, there's not much sustained coverage, is there? Which is exactly why people call it this open secret. It's sort of hiding in plain sight. And what's really striking, I think, is that it's not entirely ignored. You find articles, real reports in places like the Washington Post, Wired Magazine, going back to the early 2000s, maybe even earlier in some cases. And it's not just one group. It seems like almost every military branch has reportedly had some kind of project related to this stuff, plus commercial outfits, too. It's apparently much more widespread than you'd initially think.
Okay, so let's really unpack that. Let's talk specifics. What kind of projects are we actually talking about here? Because you mentioned quite a few areas. Right, well, the sources point to DARPA, for instance. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, they reportedly had this sonic projector, talked about around 2007, but the tech probably existed before then, you know. Then you've got the Army, reportedly working on something called Voice to Skull, V2K sometimes, and the Air Force. There are reports about them using microwaves over at Bricks Air Force Base, specifically to create sounds. The Marines apparently had something called the Medusa Project, exploring non-lethal acoustic stuff, so another angle on auditory influence. And you mentioned the Washington Post. Yeah, back in 2005, they recorded on the State Department looking into implanting voices directly into people's heads. It's not just government, right? You said commercial, too. Yeah, companies like American Technologies, they patented something called hypersound. And Halleck Research Labs, they've apparently got a patented version, too. So it's military and private sector involvement.
Exactly. And that's the key thing here, the sheer breadth of it all. This isn't, one little research project hidden away somewhere. When you see the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, DARPA, and commercial companies all reportedly working on similar concepts, it really does suggest the military-industrial complex has been, well, all over this for quite some time, deeply invested. And yet, despite these reports, even the ones in big newspapers years ago, most people seem to have absolutely no idea.
Still, really is astonishing, isn't it? These reports are out there, some from pretty solid sources, but it's like they just vanish from public consciousness. And that brings up a question for you listening right now. Why do you think that is? Why hasn't this kind of reporting, even from mainstream places, led to more awareness, more public discussion, or even concern? It's a real puzzle. Maybe the idea itself just sounds too out there, too sci-fi, so people dismiss it, even if it's in the Post.
Or maybe it's just presented in such a fragmented way, a report here, a mention there. It never quite forms a complete picture for most people.
Right. Okay, so let's pivot a bit. We've talked about the existence of these reported projects. How are they supposedly used? How do they reportedly influence people? Because it sounds like it goes beyond just making sounds.
Yeah, that's where it gets really unsettling. The claimed mechanisms are quite specific, according to the sources. One way is apparently through harassment. If you put a voice into someone's head, one that sounds clearly foreign, not their own thoughts, that constant intrusion, that voice narrating your actions or insulting you, well, the claim is it can become this intense harassment. And over time, someone subjected to that might start showing signs that look a lot like schizophrenia. And there's this idea that society is almost patterned, to just immediately label that as schizophrenia, turnkey diagnosis, without really digging into whether there could be an actual external source, like a technological one.
So it challenges the standard diagnosis.
It seems to, yeah. But then there's another reported layer. What if the voice doesn't sound foreign? What if it sounds exactly like your own internal voice? Like, when you read silently to yourself.
Your own subvocalization.
Exactly. If that kind of voice is put into your head, the claim is it just becomes the thought, your thought. And if you think it's your own thought, well, then you might just act on it, which leads to this reported idea of subliminal control, making people do things without realizing the impulse came from outside.
That's profound. The idea that a thought might not be your own. Has there been any sort of major reported instance of this tech being used? Something historical?
Well, the most cited example, the one that comes up again and again in these discussions, is the so-called voice of God weapon. It's also referred to sometimes as SQUAD, or Silent Sound Spread Spectrum, SQUAD. And the big story, the alleged use, was during the first Operation Desert Storm.
In the early 90s.
Right. The report claims that around 1,500 Iraqi soldiers just suddenly stopped fighting. They reportedly disassembled their weapons, got down on their knees, and just surrendered. All of them. And they surrendered to only about 150 Marines who apparently didn't have enough slip ties to tie them all together. That's the quote you often see.
And the explanation?
The reported explanation is that this SQUAD technology was used to put the voice of Allah directly into the soldiers' heads, telling them, lay down your arms, surrender.
Wow. If that's true, that changes everything about warfare, doesn't it? Psychological warfare taken to a whole new level.
Absolutely. It shifts it from physical force to, well, mass psychological manipulation. It's a pretty chilling idea. It's hard to see a good use for putting voices in people's heads, really.
It definitely has a dark side. You mentioned the Washington Post and Wired. Do these mainstream sources confirm something like the Voice of God incident, or is that more from other types of reports?
That's a good clarification. The reports and outlets like the Post or Wired tend to focus more on the existence of the research programs like the Army's Voice to Skull project or DARPA's Sonic Projector or the State Department's interest. The specific Voice of God incident in Desert Storm, while widely discussed in circles researching this topic and sometimes linked back to military sources unofficially, hasn't, to my knowledge, been explicitly confirmed in detail in those same major mainstream publications. It often falls into that category of highly specific, extraordinary claims that circulate based on alleged insider accounts or secondary reporting, rather than direct on-the-record confirmation from official military channels in major news outlets. So there's a difference in the sourcing for the general research versus that specific alleged application.
Okay, that distinction is important. So this brings us to a really critical point, especially thinking medically. If these technologies allegedly exist and can put voices in heads that mimic mental illness, how do you tell the difference? How does someone, say a doctor, distinguish between a person who might genuinely be targeted by this tech versus someone experiencing schizophrenia? It's a massive question.
It's a huge question and absolutely vital. And Dr. Hall, coming from that medical background, really focused on this distinction. Obviously, schizophrenia is a real recognized disorder. We're not saying everyone hearing voices is targeted. But the sources suggest some key differences. First, just prevalence. Severe schizophrenia, statistically speaking, is actually relatively rare. It affects a certain percentage, but maybe not as widespread as people think.
Okay, prevalence is one thing. What about when it starts? The onset?
Right. That's the second big factor. Onset age and the person's background. Schizophrenia usually shows up young, typically between, say, 18 and 28, maybe a bit later for women sometimes, but generally young adulthood. And often, if you look back, there were signs earlier. People might say they were never quite normal or had difficulties growing up. Now compare that to the profile reported for these alleged victims of technology. They're often older when it starts. Late 30s, early 40s is commonly cited. And crucially, they can often pinpoint the exact day it started. The day they heard the voices, the day they noticed weird stalking activity. Plus, these are frequently people who were, by all accounts, perfectly normal before. High functioning, educated, doctors, lawyers, you name it. Productive lives, and then suddenly it's like, a switch has been flipped. That's the phrase used. A very sudden, sharp onset in an otherwise healthy adult.
That is a stark contrast. Okay, so age of onset, previous functioning.
Yeah.
What about the voices themselves, what they actually say?
Another major difference, reportedly. People with schizophrenia often hear, voices of God, angels, maybe demons, or sometimes just garbled noise like background chatter you can't quite make out. It can be grandiose or just sort of nonsensical noise. But the alleged tech victims, they report hearing very specific voices. Voices of people who seem to be actively watching them, surveilling them. They often say they recognize different voices, maybe even know their names. It's described as a two-way communication system sometimes.
Two-way, so they can interact.
Apparently.
Yeah.
They report hearing the surveillors talking to each other about them and also talking directly to the target. And the content is very specific to the person's immediate reality. Voices saying things like, he's walking to the kitchen now, or commenting on what they're wearing, even repeating their private thoughts back to them. It sounds less like random hallucination and more like, well, electronic harassment, designed to be incredibly invasive and, frankly, to push someone over the edge.
Okay, that's incredibly specific and disturbing. So prevalence, onset, background, voice content. So one more key factor.
Yes. The fourth one, and maybe the most compelling from a medical standpoint, response to treatment. Schizophrenia, while serious, generally does respond to treatment. Medication, therapy, people can often manage their symptoms, sometimes quite well. You see improvement. But according to the reports on these alleged technology victims, they show no improvement on any standard psychiatric medications. None at all. They still hear the voices, exactly the same. They still report the stalking, the electronic attacks, whatever it is they're experiencing. The drugs don't touch it. And that lack of response to proven treatments is a huge red flag, clinically speaking. It strongly suggests, according to these sources, that the underlying cause might be something other than endogenous mental illness.
Right, so let's just quickly summarize that for everyone listening. The sources are drawing a line based on several things. Schizophrenia, usually young onset, maybe prior issues, voices often vague or grandiose, generally responds to medication. Alleged tech victims, often older onset, 30s, 40s, previously high functioning, sudden start, voices are specific, interactive like surveillance, and crucially, no response to psychiatric meds. That's quite a set of distinctions. Given how specific that profile is, especially the non-response to treatment, how do the reports you've seen say the medical field generally handles these cases?
Well, that's the tricky part, isn't it? Because these distinctions, while maybe clear in the accounts we're discussing, aren't part of the standard diagnostic manuals like the DSM-5. So a doctor faced with these symptoms, even the lack of response to medication, might still feel obligated to diagnose within the known framework of mental illness, schizophrenia, delusional disorder, something like that. It really highlights a potential disconnect, a gap between the established medical understanding and these reported, maybe emerging phenomena that don't quite fit the standard boxes. It's a difficult position for everyone involved.
So today we've taken this deep dive into a really complex and, let's be honest, pretty unsettling area, this reported remote neural monitoring. We've looked at the sheer number of projects reportedly involved across military and commercial sectors. We've touched on how it's allegedly used from harassment that mimics mental illness to potentially subliminal control. And we spent some time on those crucial distinctions that some sources draw between alleged victims and genuine schizophrenia cases.
Yeah, and I think this whole topic really hammers home the need for critical thinking, doesn't it? When you encounter claims like these, claims that really push the boundaries of what we think is possible technologically or even mentally, it's just so important to look carefully at the information, see the patterns, consider different viewpoints, and try not to jump to conclusions either way, either dismissing it outright or accepting it without question.
Absolutely. And that leads us to a final thought for you to consider as we wrap up. Thinking about everything we've discussed, the reported scope of these technologies, the alleged ways they can influence people, those very specific distinctions, if any significant part of this is real, how might such a silent, unseen form of influence force us to rethink things? Rethink our understanding of mental health, certainly, but also maybe ideas about personal autonomy, free will, the very nature of our own thoughts. It's a lot to mull over. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these complex and often hidden topics.